So the price of goods moves either because there's not enough supply, which is what we've had a problem with, or it's because there's too much or not enough demand. So if you've got something with restricted supply, so let's think of oil right now. Because of the Russian situation, there is not enough oil for the current demand out there. So the oil price keeps going up. So you and I pay more to drive our cars or to heat or cool our houses. So the only way of solving that one, because you can't get the Russian oil back into the market, is to make us use less oil. The price does that automatically because it gets more expensive we do it. But if you can also then just lower general demand for things, we'll drive our cars less, we'll catch less flights, all of that stuff, and that lowers demand and therefore prices. Because prices rising, inflation, is evil for our savings because the dollar in your bank account is worth less in a year's time. It's currently worth 8% less, which is quite a lot. And so it's this weird situation where we have to take the pain. We're told we can't buy as much and we're forced into it by rising our mortgage costs and our food costs and all of this stuff. And eventually things will slow down, people will be put out of jobs a bit, that kind of stuff. And then the overall demand in the economy comes down and prices come down. So we're all collectively taking the pain for this inflation that was created out of a whole bunch of different things, from the pandemic through to supply chain issues, through to underinvestment in commodities, through to the shift to green energy. All of these things have created this moment in time, which is tricky. And if we relate it to, for example, the crypto market, why did crypto stop going up? Well, it was macroeconomic factors, and people are like, well, what's that got to do with crypto? Well, really simple is it's a retail-based market, and about sometime last year, prices started to rise, and so people could afford to dollar cost average less. So then there's less demand for crypto, and the price of crypto falls. It's as simple as that. If you're finding that your food bills at the supermarket are 30% higher than they were, you spend less on something else. And we all go to our bosses and go, I want a pay rise. And everybody does that at the same time. That pushes up prices further. You get more wage rises, and that's a wage price spiral. That really has only happened in the US really once, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, when all of the baby boomers hit kind of 30 years old at the same time. So if you think when you go back to 30, you're kind of settling down with somebody, you're probably thinking about buying a house, you're buying a car, you've got a job, you're starting to earn some money. We had the largest group of people in all history turning 30 at the same time. And they all did the same thing and bought the same stuff, and that really pushed up prices. And that was at the same time there was issues with oil supply and other things. So we had this double whammy of a demand shock and a supply shock, which meant prices went crazy. But that's really only happened once. Okay, so my view, and it still remains, even though it seems pretty unfashionable right now with inflation at 8.5%, my view remains exactly what you talked about, is as prices go up, the economy slows down for the exact mechanism, and therefore it becomes self-regulating. And it becomes that because people are quite in debt, and it's a very old population in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So if you raise prices on your retired parents, they can't earn more money because they've got their pension, and that's it. So what happens is they end up buying less, and there's a big cohort of people. So that's why I think it automatically over time kind of self-corrects. But the other mechanism is the bond market, which is a fancy name for saying interest rates, the price that you and I and companies and governments can borrow. So if it becomes more expensive to borrow, so think of your mortgage, if you've got a mortgage, well then if it becomes more expensive to borrow, then you spend less. Right, so the interest rate market forces demand to come lower. Now, let's say you don't have a mortgage and you're a renter. Well, the person you rent from has a mortgage, so they will raise your rent because of it, which is why everybody's feeling this pain now, feeling a bit poorer. And that's the issue that's here. If the government can borrow at, where is it today? Let's say 2 years, they can borrow at 2.5%. So if I buy US government bonds, or I'm getting 2.5%. Now, that becomes what's known as the risk-free rate, because the government can pay you back always. But then if I'm a bank, and Tom comes to me for money, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to look at Tom's credit rating, etc., and I'm going to say it's that 2.5% plus another 1%, which is my extra profit for taking the risk. And so different people will borrow money at different rates. So it filters through. So just because it's the government, it's actually what everything is benchmarked off. And so the riskier you are, so if you're just now a 30-year-old in your first job and you've only been earning a salary for a year and a half, well, you might be able to borrow money, but it's going to be at 4% over whatever the government borrows it at, because you're riskier. Or if you're a startup and you don't have enough cash flow, well, it's going to be higher than that as well. So everything's priced off that, which is why it's so important. It's probably the single most important factor within how economies play out, is the price of which money gets lent and borrowed. So why is the price of money in the future more usually than the price of money now? Well, because potentially there's more inflation in the future, there's more uncertainty. So I want to make sure I'm being compensated to get my money back. There's a group of guys and girls at the Federal Reserve who set the price of money, but then it's really the free market that sets the rest, and nobody has a say in it. Which is why when I talked earlier about the Fed was behind the curve, we've just talked about the yield curve, and the yield curve had already started pricing in lots of Fed hikes, i.e. the cost of money needed to go up to offset the inflation. And the Federal Reserve hadn't raised the cost of money yet. So they're now busy trying to meet the expectations of the market. It's probably too late, because we've probably already slowed down the economy anyway. I think there is a narrative that says that the Fed have to do this, but you and I don't borrow at Fed funds rates. The market's already changed our mortgage costs or whatever. So I think the market does its job, but there's some belief that it has to be driven by the Fed and their Fed funds rate. So that is, I think, more of a red herring. I think the free market does its job. However, they have one more other thing in their arsenal, and that is the balance sheet. Printing money or taking money out of the economy. And they have been printing money for a long time to offset the pandemic and the extra borrowing that was required, i.e. when they print money, they're buying the bonds of the government. So the Federal Reserve are buying the bonds of the government. So it allows the government to borrow more without causing any problems. So right now they're about to start tightening, quantitative tightening. People hear the terminology. And what that basically is a fancy word for, we're going to take some money out of the economy. Well, if they stop quantitative easing, which is the first step, which they've done, that's not putting any money in, extra money in. When they do quantitative tightening, they take money out. So if there's a big pool of money sitting there, and they say, listen, we're going to take 5% of that out every year, they sell the bonds that's on their balance sheet. So they have trillions of dollars of this stuff sitting around where they've stimulated the economy. And then what they do is push it back into the economy. And the idea is it pushes up wages, or all the banks have to buy these bonds now from the government. And so then they buy these bonds and they've got less money left to lend and do other activities with. There are mechanisms by which they're essentially forced to buy the bonds. So generally speaking, it ends up on the banks' balance sheets, and that makes money more difficult because they've now put that money into something. It is weird, but if you break it down to the human element, I'm going to lend you money when I've got plenty of it. And if you're desperately in need of it, because you're going through hard times, you'll pay anything for it. And if you kind of would like to borrow some money but aren't desperate, you'll pay a lower rate. It's basically as simple as that. You know, the transaction between two people is the same thing. So if a mate of yours comes to you and you know they're a terrible creditor, but he's a friend, you're going to have to set an interest rate that maybe to make sure that you get compensated for the risk you're taking. And if you don't have much money because you're feeling a bit tight yourself, you're either not going to lend it to him or charge a bit more money because you could have used that money for something else. So leverage allows you to borrow future money to use now. So at two levels is humans are terrible. We just want everything now. We don't want to work for it. We're trying to meet our future expectations of ourselves, always. That's what drives humans. So that's why they use leverage, and it's the same with investments. So they do it for purchasing power, to bring that future expectations of themselves. Have I earned enough money to buy that car? No, but if I borrow money, I can get my future self here. It's kind of a trade-off because you're actually in debt and now owe somebody. You don't actually own the car. You own the ability to use the car until you pay that off. It's the same with a house, really. And the other point is for investments. People love to borrow money now because then you can make a bigger investment now. But the trade-off is what happens if that goes wrong? Then before you know, you get a margin call or liquidated. And that's a feature we see a lot in the crypto markets, for example. It happens kind of automatically. So humans just love this stuff because it brings their future expectations of themselves closer. I could be richer, I could have more stuff than I deserve now from my income.